So this is the last session of the day. Everybody's at home asleep or getting snacks, but a few of us are here. The title, How to Become a Star Open Source Contributor, was not chosen by me. The original title that I had for this was How to Win Friends and Influence Banks, a book pun that I was told would not fly as the primary title, but I could put it as a subtitle if I wanted to. So that's where it is. I am Eddie Knight. I'm the Open Source Program Office Manager for Sonatype. Sonatype is a software security company. We do dependency management solutions. We've been doing it for a long time. I'm also a maintainer. Most of my engineering and technical work that I do is for the fintech Open Source Foundation on their compliant financial infrastructure project. We're going to talk a little bit more about FinOS here in a bit. Another thing I do that's pretty fun is I organize the Cloud Native Security Slam for CNCF. The biggest security hygiene effort that the CNCF has ever done is going to be happening in like a couple months, October, leading up into November. I also write. I've got a couple courses coming out for Linux Foundation's training and certification platform. And wait, let's click to this. There we go. Not only did I have a baby last year, but I wrote a book. You can find that on Amazon or Audible if you care. But this is why you're here. This is why we're looking at this. The things we're going to talk about are, first up, just a general look at what open source is. I'm going to ask you a couple questions just really briefly, like who is already involved in open source in some capacity? Okay, all right, so we got some serious contribution power here. The thing we're going to talk about after we do a little bit of that overview or recap for a lot of you guys, we're going to talk about kind of figuring out what your best interests are. And so that way, when you're getting started in open source or giving advice to your colleagues who are getting started in open source, you can have a little bit of a jump pad. And then capitalizing on your contributions. This is just an ongoing thing that all of us need to be doing and remembering and thinking about. So we're going to spend some time talking about that throughout the entire talk here. So I just asked you guys who has already been involved in open source. What projects or like in what capacity? Do you guys want to like volunteer anything? Bug fixes for Linkerd. Okay, cool. Bug fix patches. So is your motivation like more just like I use this thing and so I want to make it better when I'm, so that way I don't have those bugs in my way anymore? There you go. Done, right? And that's why we consume and maintain our open source projects. Anybody else want to volunteer how you've been involved in open source? I know your answer, but you could say it anyway. Yeah. How would you say that in phrasing that I can repeat into the microphone? So you're at JP Morgan. So you work with open source for a vertical inside of JP Morgan. Okie dokie. All right. Anybody else wanted to volunteer?
Yeah, Moov actually has several, I don't know the exact count, there's many open source projects that we kind of built our company upon. We have to maintain the community around things, different components of it.
Yeah, that's huge. When your entire company is like built on and stems from and grows out of open source, being a good member of the open source community suddenly becomes your bread and butter. It's your lifeblood. It's huge. And so I'm going to move on to just share a little bit about how I've gotten involved in open source. These are going to be little flags that come up to guide me as I'm telling the story. So 2018-ish, it was in 2018. I just don't remember what part of 2018. I was at DevOps World in San Francisco, and it was the first time that I've ever interacted with humans associated with open source, and they were talking about JenkinsX, the JenkinsX platform. This dude was just going around everywhere like, JenkinsX! Just super excited, tons of energy. And then I noticed like, hey, your docs, like this, there's a whole paragraph in your docs that's just abhorrent. It's a problem. He's like, fix it. oh, I could do that. Of course I could do that. I've put my code on GitHub forever, but it didn't occur to me that I could just hop on and fix your stuff on GitHub. I didn't actually go beyond that to actually make changes and be part of a community until more than a year later, almost 2 years later, was the first time that I actually started doing open source for the first time. This was when I was working inside of one of the major financial institutions, and one of my team leads said, hey, can you go sit in and observe on some community calls? They're building some cool stuff. They might be influencing the industry in ways that we want to be aware of. Can you just go take notes, shoot them to me afterward? Eventually, as I was doing that, I realized that some of the stuff I was doing during my day job was solving the same problems that these folks were describing on their calls. So I've been sitting there just like taking notes, and as I'm sending my notes over to my team lead, I was like, hang on, does this look like they're describing the thing that we're building? Yeah, it does. So we contributed. We made it available for them to consume that and made things a little bit easier for that community. Eventually, later on that year, it was sometime around the holidays, they asked me if I would be the maintainer, or not the maintainer, one of the maintainers. There's 4 at the time. I was the 4th one. And it was a very clear request. They're like, hey, you've been involved in the community, you know the problem set, you've contributed to our documentation, to our code bases, you've been around. Are you willing to put your name on the line and take on formal responsibility? Like, yeah. Clear with my boss, but yeah. I ended up staying on as a maintainer even when I transitioned into the new role that I'm at now at Sonatype. So I changed companies, but I still stayed on as a maintainer on that project. CFI up there is the one I was talking about earlier, compliant financial infrastructure. Well, being one of the open sourcey guys in our organization, my name was thrown forward as like, hey, can you help with the Cloud Native Security Slam? Like, yeah, I'll help with that. It was the first time that I got to contribute and actually make PRs and issues on major CNCF projects, right? CNCF are the folks who host Kubernetes, for example, Argo CD, a lot of the biggest technologies that run the internet. When that was all said and done, they were like, hey, you kind of did most of the leadership for the last event. Can you just lead it from the beginning in the next one? Like, oh, okay. So now, in addition to my day job, in addition to being a maintainer for this other project, they asked me, CNCF asked me to just organize the next security event. Like, oh wow, that's huge. It's a huge opportunity. It's super fun. Sometime over the last 6 months, my supervisors kind of caught wind of all this stuff that I was doing and kind of started piecing it together and making sense of like, maybe that should just be your day job. And so now my role is the head of the open source engagements for my company. And so I do a lot of work with Open Source Security Foundation, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, obviously, and FinOS. Those are my 3 big ones. And then I'm also just kind of meeting with other people on our team to facilitate and organize and try to make sure that we're keeping our stuff in order. But one of the biggest wins out of all of this is that at KubeCon this year, CNCF is giving our event space, so that way we can do our awards. KubeCon is one of the biggest DevOps events in the world. The EU one this year had 10,000 people involved in it, right? Big event. And so highly competitive, I think somewhere between like 8,000 and 10,000 people submit to speak to it. It's just an insane number of people that are trying to be able to get on stage up there. Now we've been given a room for our event. For my company, that's a huge win, huge benefit, just because we've been contributing to this ecosystem and helping elevate their security posture, their security hygiene. They've reached back out and said, hey, you can put all your swag, put all your logos, as long as you fit this general itinerary that we need to be executed on. We don't mind that you guys brand it. You guys are the ones doing it. And that's a huge win for my company, which has been an absolute blast and a huge win for me. But that's just part of my intro to try to get to this question. All of that discussion about what I've been doing and all this kind of stuff is a small picture and a small example of what loads of other people are doing inside the open source space. So let's define it. What is open source? I've got bullet points, so that way I don't lose track and forget along my way. Open source is strategic. It's not ad hoc. It is driven by collaboration. It is visible for public review, licensed for public use. The two biggest ones that I always go to, if you were to just ask me on the spot what is open source, I'd say it's community and licenses. Those are the two biggest things. And it's never done. The same way that your software cannot just be put on a shelf after it's finished, but you need to continue updating it, maintaining it, considering user needs and use cases. Open source is the same way on steroids. It is constantly developing, constantly growing. And so maintenance is huge for it. It is not simply code, it is not simply public code. And so when we put up a public repo and just have it available for people to view, that's not open sourcing code. It is not organized chaos. There is structure, there is strategy around this. And so I'm kind of putting my own caveats and binders on when I said, hey, it's community and licenses. But I would go a little bit further and propose that if you're not organizing that and putting strategy around it, you're not doing open source well. It's not all about software. It's about community, it's about legal issues, it's about politics a lot of the times. It's not always possible for anyone to commit to. So I mentioned Kubernetes a minute ago. I've tried to make a docs improvement to Kubernetes and nobody responded. It is open source. It is well licensed, it's a great community, it is very healthy, it's growing, but they are very selective about who commits and who they even review pull requests from. And the last one that I hate to highlight, but I have to remember that this is true, it's not always the right solution. There are times and situations where it is strategic and better for an organization to keep things proprietary and private or public and not licensed. My organization has at least 4 different repositories that are public for everybody to consume and everybody to read, but we have explicitly stated that we do not have an open source strategy around these repositories. They're simply for community consumption. They're not maintained in an open source strategy because it was not prudent for those particular repos. Before I go on to this question, has anything that I've said so far piqued your guys' curiosity enough to cause a verbal discourse? Or should I say, does anybody have any questions before I continue? Okay, so the foundations. I've mentioned FinOS, I've mentioned CNCF. We should probably define these a bit because as contrast, we just heard about Moov, who's doing open source community projects that aren't within foundations. So we've got both going on, both options. HashiCorp, Red Hat, both build their open source stuff. Well, HashiCorp is a little bit questionable right now about whether it's still open source, but the point is not everybody goes with foundations, so it'd be good to just define and understand clearly what's going on in there. I'm gonna give a couple examples of foundations, but if somebody were to ask me, hey, make a slide that just kind of distills down 3 points that all foundations have into common, this is what I would spit out in a few seconds, just kind of a spitball of like, this is what all the foundations have in common. Enablement is just making sure that the projects have what they need to succeed. The foundations have tons of staff and expertise and thought already going into how to run a project well, and they're going to make sure that your project has those things at your disposal whenever you need it, including freaking marketing support, right? Technical support at times where you're like, hey, we're just absolutely hitting a wall. Can somebody else help us? Being part of a foundation means that there is somebody to go to with that kind of situation. Oversight is, again, what it says on the board. Just having some sort of technical oversight to guide your decisions, somebody that can come in and be like, hey, we noticed you've been steering the ship this direction, but we see that the market's going this direction. And community oversight is kind of huge because when something weird happens, or if an accusation of something weird happens, it's really nice to have somebody else that can step in. And so the foundations are gonna do that. And then advocacy, I'm separating this on my notes from marketing. So it's not necessarily like your product advocacy, but really the advocacy of the concepts surrounding your product, your project, whatever it is that you're putting out. So social and political support, policies and standards, interacting with the White House, interacting with CISA, NIST, MITRE. These are the kinds of things that we see the foundations doing on a regular basis. One of the big places that they tried to interact was last month and the whole better part of the year leading up to it. the European Union passed the Cyber Resiliency Act, which a lot of folks consider to be a death knell for open source in Europe because of the way that it was phrased and the way that it's opening up lawsuits and things. The foundations worked really, really hard, long hours spent between legal and public and just trying to raise awareness, so that way those legislators were informed when making those decisions. A lot of people aren't happy with those decisions, but the decisions were made, and now we're working with it. On that scale, those three things that I just listed up here, I pulled up a couple examples that are kind of a sliding scale between what they prioritize. You're nodding really intensely. Can you guess where one of these would fit? Just like pick one of those from Apache, LF, or free software. Can you guess like what sliding scale we're doing here? Okay. Was there a guess? No problem. Apache focuses really, really, really hard on enablement. They've got somewhere like 100 projects, Apache, Kafka, a bunch of other projects, code bases that are run really well by really clever maintainers, and there is a thin layer of oversight and not a lot of like political advocacy, that kind of stuff, or at least if it's happening, I'm not aware of it. Their huge focus is on enabling projects. On the other side, Free Software Foundation, standing here right now, the only thing that I can remember that they have as far as software projects is the new project, the GNU, new kernel. But they are highly involved in the advocacy realm, the political side, raising awareness for free and open source software. If you've heard the name Richard Stallman, this is the type of stuff that they do, that they're known for. Linux Foundation is kind of right in the middle, kind of the balance. Tons of code bases that they are enabling, making really cool stuff happen. Finos is one of the sub-foundations that they actually enable. So Linux Foundation has a ton of sub-foundations. On their website, they've got some examples of them to categorize them. CNCF is one of the Linux Foundation. You got Tux right there. Open Source Security Foundation is a huge one when it comes to advocacy. Finos is one that we're gonna keep talking about because they are banking, finance related. There are hardware projects inside of LF, standards, data, all sorts of different stuff that's going on that they're supporting and enabling. They're also kind of an events racket. They've got a bunch of really, really big events that a lot of money flows through and just a lot of stuff happens, and they do it really well. And that would be kind of a different layer that's just focused on community and enablement, that sort of stuff. And then they're also, especially through the OpenSSF and Finos that I'm very familiar with, they are very involved with regulatory, compliance, standards, governmental oversight, that type of stuff. They're very, very, very involved in that advocacy layer. So now we've talked about what open source is. I gave you my weird journey over the last couple of years as I've gotten more involved in open source. Talked a little bit about the foundations. Before we talk about your strategy and like building a strategy for becoming a star open source contributor, we should probably just like pause for a second and talk about the opposite of the foundations. There is a lot of benefit and a lot of risks that are gained by operating open source projects outside of foundations. So I mentioned earlier, Red Hat and HashiCorp are really big on doing their own thing, and in some ways they've done it really, really well. They've gotten a lot of community support, a lot of community enablement. They've got different strategies between the two of them that I'm not going to try and nuance right now, but there are risks that are involved in that, and it should simply be aware that right now, operating outside of those foundations with open source, over the last 2 weeks has gotten like a really bad reputation because somebody like HashiCorp can come in and say anything after version 1.5.5 is no longer covered under the Mozilla license. It is covered under a vague license that explicitly says, if you're confused by our vague terminology, please contact us. I don't think that they're malicious in doing it, but it has caused a lot of people to question and raise questions about operating outside of foundational oversight. So that's why I've focused on foundation specifically for that conversation. But that is not the next. The next is determining your strategy. So when you're trying to figure out why am I contributing to open source, One example, we talked about bug fixes. Contributing to open source because it's something you use, something you're excited about, and something you want to make better is a legitimate strategy. It also has benefits. Maybe you're not super excited, maybe you're not such a heavy user that you're finding your own bugs and things, but you want those added benefits as well. Same thing. Boosting your resume, building technical skills, building relationships for your personal career are huge, huge benefits that every single contributor to open source is able to capitalize on. If you want to work with one of these logos, find a project inside of the FinTech Open Source Foundation, because all these logos are there. They're hanging out. They're doing things. They're solving the same problems. On a personal level, that's great, because now I today got some preview knowledge about Google's GCP, what they're doing as it relates to regulation and standards and compliance. I can't share that with you because in the last 3 hours I haven't gotten word on whether or not that's disclosable information, but it's just an added thing in my toolbox that I'm able to be on these calls with Morgan Stanley, with JPMC, all these kinds of guys that are hanging out here. I go up and I recognize them because I've been active in these. That's huge for me, but also for your company. You probably are going to see some logos up here that you want to be doing business with, you want to be respected by, you want to be familiar with, right? When somebody's deciding a vendor to work with, and that vendor logo has been up here for the last 3 years, it's going to be front of mind compared to the one that they haven't known. And so there's benefits from your organizational standpoint. But we're not here to talk about your open source strategy. We're not here to talk about your OSPO. We're here to talk about you becoming a great contributor. So you could get your company listed up here. That might be your motivation. Your motivation might be to build networking, build relationships. Your motivation might be to develop your skill set. But to do it, you need to do it well. And so the next little section here that we're going to talk about is how to do it in a way that is effective and will actually help you pursue those goals that you've set for yourself, which I hope you have. So the first thing is figure out where you want to engage. Based on your goal, right? I want to be a better Golang developer, so I want to be around more Golang engineers that are solving different problems than I solve in my day job. Okay, find a project that does that. I want some more logos for my company. Okay, find the company with the right logos. Once you've figured out where you want to be engaging, connect with them. This is important. I'm going to give examples of this in a second, but actually talking and being part of that community through social engagement is really important. And then do your contributions. Find out what needs to be fixed and fix it. Find something that they plan to improve and improve it. Find a feature that they plan to add and add it. This one, the next two kind of blend together. Keep going. That's the last big thing, is like the capitalizing on this to be able to really profit from these contributions doesn't come from your first 1, 2, or 3 contributions. It comes from that relationship that you've built during that season. If your entire motivation is just to have a better product, because I'm super excited about Argo CD and I want Argo CD to be the best freaking GitOps platform in the world, that's a great motivation, and you will know more about the product, you'll know more about the roadmap, you will be more recognized in the community, you'll be better equipped in all ways to contribute and make it better because you have persisted and continued to solve problems over time. So a lot of us in the room have already made our first open source contribution, but maybe you want to give advice to somebody else, or maybe you just want to make a first contribution to a new project. A lot of times, switching from an existing project to a new project is just as hard as starting completely from scratch. So we're going to start completely from scratch. When you see that project, you've targeted it, you know where you want to go, and you want to make that first contribution, first thing you're going to want to do is get some context. Actually, look at the code base and try to find out what you can know. So I put up some examples right here. If there's a contributing.md, that's generally your instructions from the maintainers that they've given to you, And it's gonna be ad hoc. It's gonna be like, hey, this is what we expect, this is where we put stuff, these are the checks that are gonna run, this is how you can run stuff locally. If that file is there, start there. It's a great place to start. If you see code owners files, these are utilized to dictate who is able to approve PR changes to different files or directories within the repo. That's really great knowledge when you're trying to figure out where to contribute. Because later on, as you're thinking, oh, I want to make a change to this thing, look at the code owners whose name is listed. If that's there, it's a huge tool for you to be able to get more context. The README, obviously, READMEs you need to read. The reason we don't read READMEs is because they're written by engineers for engineers, which means I didn't really care that much when I was writing this, and I expect you to care enough to figure out whatever I wrote down. So it's torture when you have to go and read a README that's just been kind of thrown out by the development team, but do it anyway. Even if it's a bad README, frickin' read it. Security.md, security.txt, securityinsights.yaml. If you see a security-related file in the repo, that's gonna have a lot of good information. Some of it's not super useful for contributing. It's like, oh, here's how to make a vulnerability report. But a lot of times that's gonna contain information about what CI checks are being run, what they expect from their contributions related to security, things like that. So check out any security-related documentation they have as well to give you that context. Start a conversation. You have the context. You should probably know by now where they're doing their conversations. Are they on Slack? Are they on Discord? Do they just mostly stick to GitHub issues? In this example from last year, it was a project, that is Peter, so that would have been Argo Helm. That project uses their Q&A on GitHub. There's a discussions tab, and you can just type in a question. And I happened to look and see that they were actively using that. And so I dropped a question in there. The two purple notes that I have on here to remind myself of what to talk about, put it somewhere that they're actually going to look at it, and then use your words. Tell them what you're proposing, why you're proposing it, what the impacts are, and level with them as humans because you know that they're reviewers that have other things that they're responsible for. So give them as much context as possible before contributing. And the point of this, the number one key point here is that you want to make sure that you are alleviating work, not adding it. If I'm coming in with a bug fix, I want to make sure, hey, are you guys already working on this bug? I think I know a good way to fix it. Would this be a solution that you guys are welcome to? Super easy. The answer is usually just like, no, we haven't gotten to that. Yes, that looks good. Please do it. Thanks. Then figure out where they're tracking their work. If they're not tracking their work, they're kind of disorganized. They need to improve on that. Most projects are tracking their work in some way. The most common way to track work is going to be in the GitHub issues. It may also be somewhere else. They may have like an external Confluence or something. But if it's an open source, it'll probably be public, and you'll be able to post something there. So post it there, describe what you're going to do before you do it. Oh, if it's already been tracked, just add to that conversation, don't start a new one. And in this case, I linked, in the work tracking, I linked to that Q&A. So that way, as I'm tracking the work, people can go back and be like, wait, where did this come from? What conversation have we already had around it? Do the work one step at a time. This seems really simple, but on that left side, you see over there, when I went to make commits, on this particular repo, there was a really funny format in their entire Git history. Every single commit had this like word and then parentheses and then a colon and then the actual commit message. And so what I found was that and since then I've learned that quite a few projects do it this way, there is automation that's built in around their contributions. So as a commit is made, different CI is gonna kick off based on how that's phrased. And so take your time to make sure that the work you're committing is committed in the way that they're expecting it to be. Use clear descriptive titles. Breaking up your PR. If you're working and you're solving a problem and you see over here that some docs have some typos in it, just don't, right? Your pull request is here for one specific thing. The reviewer is going to be reviewing that one specific thing. If you give me 14 files of like a period here, a white space fix here, that kind of stuff, it's like, that's great. But now I have 15 files to check instead of 2, and you've added cognitive overload. you're trying to lift weight off my plate, but in a way, you kind of put a different weight there. Make sure you don't do that. Take it slow. Do it one at a time. Separate it into multiple pull requests if you see more things that you want to do. After you've created that pull request, don't just walk off unless you've drafted the pull request. That's a feature on GitHub. I think GitLab has something equivalent. But if your pull request is not in draft mode, make sure that your checks are passing. So in this case, I think my checks were not successful because I didn't sign my commit with like git commit -s, right? I just did git commit -m with the message, but I didn't add the -s to sign it, so the checks failed. And if I had just walked off and been like, I got my goal for tonight, I committed it, opened the PR, walked off before seeing those checks, then somebody else would have come on, would have looked at it, saying like, okay, there's a review here to do, but it's got failing checks. You just wasted my time because I had to come all the way in here. I did a mental switch to get into reviewing mode, and then your checks aren't even passing. It's a disrespect to that reviewer. So make sure that you resolve your checks. Answer questions. It doesn't matter who it's from. Is it from the maintainer? Is it from a community member? Doesn't matter. Answer questions, because high chance when the maintainer reads that community member's question about your pull request, they'll want the answer to that question, even if they themselves didn't answer the question. And if feedback is given, make sure that you apply the feedback. It doesn't mean do everything that is recommended, but apply the feedback as you see fit. And that got to the end of that one. So that's roughly how you can make your first contribution on a repo. My phone died, so I don't know how we're doing on time. We're doing good. Anybody have questions about that? I kind of just ran through that and then got to the end and didn't realize that I was at the end, and I was like, cool. As far as like making your first commit to a new project, was there anything in there that you guys like want to highlight or spend more time on? So I keep touching on capitalizing. If you want to get the most out of this process, right? If you want to be engaged with this project because you think it's super cool and you like that project and you want it to be the best project in the world, if you want to be around smarter, better engineers than you and get different perspectives that you can learn from and grow, if you want to add logos to your resume or build relationships that your company can take advantage of, do not promote yourself. Just don't. Don't ask for things. Don't add weight. So frankly, this bullet right here, I've ruined it for all of you guys. If you're in the OpenSSF, the CNCF, the FinOS, they're used to people like me coming in and just being like, hey, what do you think about, hey, can I share something with you? And they're just like, holy shit, stop, please calm down. I've learned this the hard way. Over-communication is not the best thing to do when you have a community with hundreds of people. Right, so make sure that you are being strategic in your interactions, strategic in your requests, and strategic in your contributions. Don't fail to deliver on a promise. Now, I'm putting nuance on this, because if you find an issue and you're like, hey, I'd like to tackle that, I think I can do this. You need to say that you're working on that, even if you don't know whether you will finish it. But the instant that you don't know whether you'll finish it, you need to let people know, so that 3 weeks don't pass and then somebody comments saying, hey Eddie, what was the status on this? You said you were trying to fix it. Oh yeah, I hit some obstacles, my whole entire family died. Like, I don't care what it is. The instant that you don't know whether you're gonna be able to complete this, just pop back in and let folks know, hey, I was really excited about this, but I don't think I'm gonna be able to make it. Right? I don't think I'm gonna be able to get that across the finish line. If you fail to deliver on promises, you will not build the relationships that you need. Don't talk more than you contribute. Again, I've ruined this for all of you guys. Open source communities have a really, really long history of people coming in and asking questions, giving suggestions, theorizing, brainstorming, and then just coming back to the next community meeting and doing the same thing again without doing anything more than just fluffing up the time. Talking and asking questions is fine, making suggestions is fine, but make sure that when you are contributing, it is actually to push things forward, and it's not to just fill the clock with conversation. If you can't fix something, don't don't kill yourself. Because if you focus on the things that you can't fix, you focus on the things that you can't improve, you're spending time that you could have been investing in actually solving problems for the community. And this goes back to the first one. Cool, you did a good job not showing up and saying how great your stuff is. Good, right? But also don't expect me to elevate you simply because you did something for me yesterday, right? Like that quick tit for a tat is not something that we do, right? We are all contributing to this. We all know that we have our needs. We are all aware that you have your goals, but you have to flip them around. As soon as I see you in the community, I am already thinking for ways that I can elevate you. If you are anywhere in my vicinity, I'm thinking, is there a way I can elevate you? But if you come and you say, hey, could you, because I did that thing last week, all that stuff that was churning in my head just kind of fizzled out. I'm not as excited to lift you up now anymore because you're expecting it and you're making it a thing. What to do? Find things you can improve. Find other people who are working on things and figure out how you can make it easier for them to do that. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Take notes in meetings. This is something that I don't do nearly enough, but when I do it, my life is so much better. When there are calls, when there are community meetings, when there's something that stands out in a Slack thread or a Discord conversation, write it down. Keep a hold of that because it's going to help you in the long run to just keep track of the things that are happening in the community. And this is the opposite of expecting a quick tit for tat. Make sure other people know what your goals are because we're all looking for ways to elevate each other. We're all looking for ways to lift each other up. Just let me know what it is that you're doing. Let me know why it is that you're here. Don't make it a thing. Don't make it weird, but do share it. So, would anybody like to, before we wrap up, just share a little bit about why you are interested in open source? We already know Moov. You guys are just doing it, taking over the world. Are you still Mr. Bug Fix Man? That's your big motivator for doing open source?
Usually that's the thing. I have, there's a project that works, and I have a bug, I'm going to fix it, or it's a feature that I need, so I'll go in and slap something on it.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share any goals that you have when it comes to open source? Turns out workshops aren't workshopping. This is just a talk. I'm supposed to be the one talking. That was the end of everything I have to present. So if you guys have anything that you want to talk about more, yeah, please.
Yeah, so I have a question around licenses. So one of the biggest things is, there's no TLDR for licenses. You want to look for that.
Yeah.
You use this to support it.
Yeah.
Is there any good resources you recommend to learn more about that?
Yeah, so the internet is full of people's opinions, right? I actually just grabbed one guy's opinion that happened to have it in print form. Just open source license agreements. It's 30 pages and it's just sitting on my shelf. So whenever I'm like, oh, I want to quick refresh, I just pull it out. It's 30 pages long. There's a lot of good resources. Largely what you want to look for is things with caveats. That's when you're getting further away from open source. When it's hey, everybody can use this as long as you buy me a beer if you see me at the bar. That's beerware. Everything about the license is totally fine. Hey, you can fork it, you can extend it, you can contribute to it, all that kind of stuff. But if you see me at a bar, you owe me a beer. That is in the license, therefore it's legal language. That caveat is now considered by your legal team risk. And so my company, we do dependency management. Part of that is we scan licenses. If we see the word beer in a license, we will raise that as a corporate risk. So those are the types of things you want to look. The trend is if you see caveats. Anybody can use this unless you work for Jeff Bezos. Maybe be careful with that. That sort of stuff. Any other thoughts that you guys have from this topic? Yeah?
How do I go beforehand if I write a patch for a piece of software that they'll review it or consider it and they're going to get shelled
Yeah. So part of that getting context phase is finding out how are they handling it, right? So I mentioned to you with Kubernetes, I didn't go and get the context beforehand. Fortunately, I was just like making a typo fix and it sat on the shelf for weeks, right? And that's when I got some context from somebody else. They're like, oh, Kubernetes doesn't take public contributions. Like you need to be on a named list. Like, oh, how do I get on that list? They're like, oh, there's a process. Like anybody can get on it, but like there's a process. So while you're getting context, look at past pull requests, right? Have they been merging pull requests recently? A big red flag is, are they just committing without making pull requests? I mean, jump off a bridge, that's a problem. But are they merging pull requests from anybody outside of their organization? So Red Hat is great at taking contributions from everybody. HashiCorp is not. Generally speaking, they take contributions from their teams. And you can look at their history and see who's getting pull requests merged and then who's got pull requests just sitting still. Issues, same thing. Are issues getting closed? You can kind of get some of this context. And if you get that context and you find out where they're having conversations, then that's another way that you can protect yourself, is have a conversation before you spend time on the work. So that way you actually know, like, hey, is this something that's gonna help you, gonna elevate the community, nobody responds? Well, they're sure not gonna respond to your pull request. So that's, so getting context, starting the conversation, and then tracking the work before you do it is another way to get, hey, we had that conversation, you responded to me, now I came over here and I wrote out everything that I intend to do. And I mentioned in a comment, I'm starting on this, right? Like you've given them another chance to tell you, don't waste your time, don't waste my time. And by that point, I would be very surprised if you didn't get a review on your pull request. Those are really good questions. I feel like that could have just been the entire presentation, just talking about those two things. Anything else come to mind for you guys? Is there anything stopping you guys from personally or organizationally getting involved in open source projects?
I think as an organization, we don't know the boundaries of, what should be open up versus, what do you want to do for yourself? I guess as an org.
Yeah.
Advocacy.
Like actually,
Advocating for ways the spec can be used, might get some benefit from, outreach or something by publishing it. There's a lot of advocacy involved. As an org, all of us understand what the benefits are.
yeah. So considering that you're in finance or fintech, right? I would recommend that you just have a conversation with the Fintech Open Source Foundation. Just be like, hey guys, I know you only take contributions from members, but we're exploring this. We're trying to figure, and that's the stuff that they do all day long. And so just talking with people who are working in this space, solving those problems is a really good place to start. Yeah, finos.org. You can go to their Slack channel. They've got a lot of, I'll get distracted if I try to find it, but yeah, finos.org, yeah. Yep. Well, I think that brings us to time. So we're good to go. Thank you guys, really appreciate it.